Hello, and welcome to the 7th video in this Twitter integration video series. In this video, I'd like to cover the archive provider that we leverage in order to populate the archive control in our 6-web application. First, we'll start off by taking a look at some of the dependencies here. As you can notice, I've got a couple of using statements here that drill down into the DimeBrain TweetSharp library. If I look at my references, I am included the DimeBrain.TweetSharp library, as well as one of its dependencies, the Newtonsoft.json library. I have also included this dependency because I'm going to be requesting the tweets via JSON as well. Just like every other archive provider in NetServer, each class that is going to represent our archive provider and implement our archive provider interface requires this archive provider attribute. The parameters for the constructor in this archive provider attribute takes in the name of the archive provider as well as a priority level for this archive provider. The priority simply states that if this provider has the same name as another archive provider loaded in NetServer, the one with the lowest priority number takes precedence over higher numbers. The class we're going to actually inherit from, the iArchive provider interface, which if we drill down into also expects to have other interface methods implemented in the class that implements the iArchive provider interface. We'll take a little bit closer look at what the provider has rows, provider has columns, and has entities methods. And of course the iPlugin interface is required by the framework to be discoverable as a plugin for NetServer. Great. So if we start off, we're going to continue down here and take a look at some of the member variables declared inside this class, and then we're going to see how they're used down inside the body of our class. Okay, so the first paragraph here of member variables are simply utility member variables. For example, counter, reverse are going to be leveraged inside the add rows method, or I'm sorry, get rows method. We'll take a look at how they're used. I've also declared some pagin variables here as well for page size and page number, but I'm not using pagin yet in this archive provider. The reason why I'm not using it is because the Twitter interface, or the library we're using for the Twitter interface by default only returns a maximum of 20 tweets per entity we're requesting, whether it's 20 tweets where we've been mentioned or 20 tweets of the people we're following, etc. So there's not a great deal or a great need for pagin at this point. Specify the provider name, which is going to be also leveraged by the constructor of the archive provider attribute. And then we're also going to leverage this provider name variable down below inside our class when it comes to dealing with providing a link hint for the row. And we'll see we pass that into nav equals, and this is actually going to be the page that this archive control exists on, and we're going to set that to Twitter because the name of our Twitter page is called Twitter, SO Twitter page. Okay. The next set of member variables we have declared here are used for our archive column info data types. These are simply string constants that represent the tweet ID, the username, text, source, and created date textual values. And these I use inside, again, the constructor of the archive column info. The archive column infos are used, essentially, are the columns that are going to be exposed inside each row of our archive. right? The next set of member variables are the Twitter entity names, and again, these are string constants that correlate to the entities we add in the constructor. The entities provide two functions. The first is on the control itself. If we switch to the application, each entity, if it is declared as optional, will enable a checkbox on the archive control. An optional means if I select one of these or deselect one of these, it's going to refresh this archive control, and the archive control is going to call back to the archive provider and say, hey, I'm requesting this entity type. Can I have these entities as well? Now, each one of these entities are going to be assigned to one or more of these records, or each one of these rows inside the archive control, or the result set. So, for example, I have selected friends and mentions. So at the top here are all of my friends, or the people that I'm following, and if I look at the definition for this row, the entity that's assigned with this row is a friend entity. If I scroll down a little bit here to the bottom and I see my mentions everywhere that I've been mentioned, the entity that's associated with this row is mentions. So those are the two uses for leveraging entities inside archive providers. So I'm mentioning their names here, and in the constructor we'll take a look at how we're constructing those. Okay, so now if we go back up, so we have the Twitter entity names. We'll just cover those. We'll talk about those a little bit more. Below that we have two helpers that we're going to leverage inside this class. First, we're using a column helper, which will encapsulate all of our columns that we're defining in each one of these rows returned by the provider. And then we're also using an entity helper that we're going to help use these entity names, or more specifically, the archive entity infos that we declare in the constructor of the archive provider. We'll talk a little bit more about that really quickly soon. The member variables for order by and restrictions are also going to be declared here, and these are going to be set a little bit later by the archive control or any caller on this archive provider. The archive columns that each one of our rows will encapsulate are declared as member variables, and I'm using the _col prefix here for a very specific reason. The reason I'm doing that is because in the column helper, when I go in the constructor here of the tweet archive provider, I'm going to instantiate a new instance of this column helper, and I'm passing it in an instance of this class. And the column helper, it's using reflection in order to discover all of these archive column info types. And it's specifically looking for this _col prefix. And then it's going to use that in order to get obviously all of the information that we used to declare those archive column info data types. Alright. So each archive column info only represent a single column in our row. So looking at the constructor, you can see that I'm instantiating some default paging information, which again we're not using. We're instantiating a new column helper, which we just talked about, and then we're instantiating a new entity helper. So all I have to do is call on the entity helper's add available entities method, because there is no constructor that will be able to discover this sort of information. I'll call add available entities, and for each one of the entities that this archive provider is going to support, we're going to add a new entry into this collection. So it takes three parameters in order to instantiate an archive entity info. First is the name of the entity, the display name, and then finally the is optional parameter. Again, as we stated earlier, the is optional directly correlates to whether or not we have a checkbox available on the archive control. Right, if we set this to false, so this is not optional, it doesn't make any sense to have a checkbox here because we're always going to display information of that entity type. So now we get to probably the heart of this archive provider, and that has to deal with the getRows method. Just as a quick mention, I don't have any resources that I need to close in this archive provider. It's just a bare bones archive provider. So I'm just going to essentially show that this supports close but doesn't actually do anything. Getting back to getRows. Now we actually want to populate the enumerable archive row type that will be returned by this getRows method. And this of course is going to return the result set that is used to populate all of these. It's all of these rows right here. So we have rows, right? And then each one of these rows have column infos, archive column info types. So I'm going to create a generic list of archive rows that I will eventually return or loop through and return those items. And the first thing that we need to do is get our list of desired entities. When an archive control invokes an archive provider, one of the first methods it's going to call is set archive or set entities or set requested entities. Let's take a look at that. Set desired entities, and I pass those into the entity helper. Okay. It gets those values from the archive control here, which whatever is selected. So give me those desired entities. So the desired entities are exposed as a property on the entity helper, and you can see that they're returned as a string array, and it makes it very easy to work with if it's exposed as a list. So I'll go ahead and just instantiate that into a list. And then if you look again back at our Twitter page definition for our archive control, we set these three restrictions for the application name, and device ID. And these correspond to values we have saved in our data carrier collection inside the Twitter data handler. Inside our credential entity, there's a data type called credential carrier, which has application name, and device ID property. And we're going to pass the values of that into our set restrictions method when the archive control is invoked. So when the archive control is invoked, one of the first things it's going to do is also call the set restrictions method. We can see that down below. It'll call set restrictions, and it will pass those values in, and I'm going to save those into the archive restriction info array. Okay. So coming back down to our getRows, I'm going to use this handy method called getRestriction, which is going to loop through all of our restrictions and see if there's a name that corresponds with application name, device ID, or device name, and then get its value and return that. And when we're going to assign that up here, getRows, to the properties of a credential carrier, because then I can pass this credential carrier into this credentials helper credentials exist method, which if the credentials for the currently logged on user exist inside the foreign keys or the foreign key tables that these values represent, then it's going to go ahead and continue on. If it does not exist, then it's simply going to return nothing in this getRows method. Right. So as long as the credentials exist, then it's also going to populate inside that method the username and password for that credentials helper, or that credentials carrier data type. And that is what I'm going to use here in the DimeBrains TweetSharp library's Fluent Twitter interface. Call request, authenticate, and I'm going to pass in the username, and I'm going to decrypt the password stored in the foreign key table. So with that username and password, I'll authenticate, and we'll continue on. And then this is where I check if the desired column is actually being requested. So, is public actually checked? Was it set as a desired column? This is where the list comes in handy, because I can just use the contains method. If public is checked, then go ahead and call the Twitter API as JSON, get back all of the statuses, or all of the tweets, for the public type. Then I'll go ahead and call the add rows method, which will pass in that rows list, and then add all of those statuses, add rows there. If the desired entities, or if friends was checked for the people that I'm following, it will go ahead and do the exact same thing. I probably could have encapsulated these ifs into a method because they all do exactly the same thing. They're just going to add more rows to the result set based on whether or not they were public, friends, own, and mentions. So we'll build up those rows, and then we'll close the Twitter account, or the Twitter session, and then I'm going to do some filter operations. If there was filtering executed, I'll sort those rows and then reset my counter. I'll reverse the rows because I always want the latest tweets shown first, and then I'll yield each one of those records. So let's go ahead and break down into the add rows method so we can see how that's being constructed. Right, so we can imagine we're getting back a Twitter status here, or a group of statuses, and then we go add rows, and then I'm going to look at each one of those status types, passing in the entity, and I'm going to create a new archive row. I'm also going to create a new archive column data type. So now I'm going to start looking at the desired columns, because archive providers are called from not just archive controls, but also they can be used anywhere you use NetServer. They're just programmed to use over one or more tables in the database or external resources like we're doing here. Right, so we can go ahead and set desired columns, so that instead of saying select all from this archive provider, we could say select just the name and the ID from this archive provider and get those back. So by default, when the archive provider loads up this data, or instantiates the archive provider, it will also say set these columns as the desired columns to show, and that's of course based on the configured columns that are defined inside the archive column list config file, or what we have changed here. Now again, I haven't enabled this context menu to configure the columns. We'll do that in the next video. Okay, so desired columns, just to kind of show you that does exist, that is implemented via the provider has entities interface. So we'll say set desired columns, set desired entities, set desired columns, sorry, by the provider has columns interface, yes. Okay. Add rows. So we'll get those desired columns, and then for each one of the items in the statuses, for each one of those return statuses, we'll create the archive row. We'll set the entity assignment for that row, whether it was public, friends, mentions, or own. We'll set the counter for the primary key, and the reason why we had to use this utility variable was because primary key is only of type integer, and the ID values associated with tweets are actually long values. They have long since surpassed the integer capacity for that data type, and so I cannot store that here in the primary key, so I have to use my own, so I'm just making them up as we go. Static member variable that increments a little bit later in these methods. Okay. And then for the row, I add on a link hint, which is going to be associated with when I click or double click on one of these rows. I can associate a link hint for some action that can happen based on that operation. What we need to do is assign a nav variable here. And this is generally associated with the entity that this row belongs to. So we're setting the entity here, and let's take, for example, we're setting it to a public entity. Okay, when we click or double click on that row in the archive control, it can have an action associated with it specific for the public entities, or for this case, the public tweets. Now if we assign an entity type of, for example, mentions, then when we click on that row, we can have another action occur specific to that entity. So for a mentions entity, the actual text that goes here has to be equal to the type we define for our link info element. Let's take a second to look at that link info element. So here I've opened up the SOArchive control link info types.config file. And each one of these link info elements can be associated with a click or a double click event within a or for a row in the SOArchive control. The name that we're going to specify for the type here is actually what's going to be tied to the nav equals text. So nav equals, and then this text that's associated here is going to be tightly coupled with this type that goes here. Now we haven't talked about this file yet, and we will in a subsequent video. So I won't go too much further in detail other than to say that for this archive provider, we are always going to associate nav equal to the provider name, so Twitter in this case. And in that way, when it comes time for us to declare our link info events that are going to happen, I'll specify a type equal to Twitter for both a click and a double click event. Okay. Then we're going to assign the tweet ID, which is for the row, and we can set this as a current, right? So we go back to our application config file. Let me open that up. Application config file. Now if we scroll down to the constants, you'll see that we've actually declared a tweet constant. Or I'm sorry, not a constant, but a current. So currents have essentially 3 values associated with them. They have the root name, which is defined here as the ID, but underlining inside this current type, it also has an ID, it also has a name, and it also has a type property associated with it. And we can use those within our application in order to assign values to them. So for this link hint, I'm going to assign the tweet ID, the count actually, for this row inside my archive control. And then for the tweet name, which accepts a string value, this is where I'm actually going to assign the tweet ID, which is going to be a long. So I know that that container will be able to contain the value. Great. So now we pass by there, and now we're going to create the actual archive column data type. And then I'm going to instantiate that with the display value and the tooltip, which will actually be the ID as well as the count. And I'm going to call this row column data add method, which is going to add in a key and then a value pair. So essentially the string is the key, and then archive column data is the actual value. And then I'll assign to the row the entity that was passed in. So this will be actually entity name. It looks like I'm doing that twice, so I can get rid of this one there. Great. Okay. Now we look into if this is a desired column. If the desired column contains a user, then go ahead and add that column to that row. So if we call into add columns, we'll see that we're actually just creating another archive column data type, passing in some information. Also, the key here is this link hint, and that's kind of interesting because yes, if we look at the archive control, each one of these rows can have link hints associated with them, but so can each one of the columns. So what you can think of is if I click on, let's say, a username, nothing happens because there's no link hint associated with a username. We can see that when we call add column and we pass in a user, the link hint is just an empty string. However, when I'm creating a source, I'm calling this method, helper method, called extract name and URL from the source from a Twitter status, which actually is the URL and the name of a application that submitted this tweet entry. So I'm going to get back the actual URL as well as the name of that application, and I'm going to call add column on that, passing in the name and the URL for that application. And then so here in the constructor for this archive column data, I'm going to pass it in as a link hint. And what's going to happen is when that archive column is displayed, I have associated with it an actual JavaScript method called window.open, and it will invoke the URL that was associated with the application. So if I click on TweetDeck, you'll see it opens a new window and navigates to the TweetDeck application. If I click on the Twirl source, it will open up the Twirl application website. Okay, so that's a column link hint. And now I'll just go ahead and also add that to the column data collection. Great. I'm doing that for each one of the columns to see if they're a desired column, and then I'll return that row to the added row method. Okay, so that's where add rows method is called. Then that calls add columns, and then we're going to go ahead and close the Twitter connection. Then we're going to do some filter operations and then some sort operations. The filter operations is going to look at the archive restriction info types. So these are our restrictions that are set into our member variable whenever the archive control calls set restrictions and passes in an array of restrictions. Now you can notice that I'm using certain criteria here for my operators. The operators that I'm allowing sorting operations, or I'm sorry, filter operations on, are begins, and this is strictly for string values, and then also between for datetime types, datetime filters. The way that filters work is if we go back to our Twitter page, inside the application, there's this filter icon up here. This filter icon is created only when we have enabled that inside our Twitter page. If I just undo this real quick, I've added this element called enable dynamic filter. I've set that to true, and with that I get this filter icon up here. So when I click on the filter icon, that adds a new row into my archive control and allows me to do things like filter based on the data types that I've defined. So I can do filter operations on any one of the columns. If I go to my archive provider, we'll scroll up to the top and we'll look at the column definitions. Wherever I have said we can do restrictions, right, can order by, and also display types is visible, and the last parameter here is the restriction types. Restriction types will set whether or not my column is filter capable. So as long as that's true, I can come in here and filter some of my data. see if I go be filtered away. Okay, looks like I'm taking certain things away here. Alright, so now we're seeing everything in between August 1st and August 7th, 2009. Now I'm just going to expand on that and see everything after that. Great. For text, I can also set restrictions, right? Because they're text values. I can say, let me see everything that starts with H, for example. I'll just type in H, hit enter. It's going to call set restrictions, and then get rows, and the filter operations are going to filter out everything except things that start with H. So that's where I get that filter capability. Okay, based on begins as well as between. If we look at the sort method, when I do some sort operations, sort rows, I'm going to essentially pass in the rows, and then I'm going to check, make sure the order by's array is not null and that its length is greater than 0. As long as that's true, I'm going to sort based off the order by name, and that'll be user, text, source, or created date, right? Those correspond to the column names that we have available. And then I'll just go ahead and use some simple built-in compare operations to do the sort operations. When I'm dealing with date values, the way that archive providers handle data and their data types, they kind of encode them in the results. So we use this culture date formatter data type that is buried inside the superoffice.crm.globalization namespace, and we use this in order to piece apart or put together information or data that we want to be displayed in our application. This column date formatter probably deserves its own article in order to discuss how and where it's being used and how you can leverage it in your applications as well. Hopefully look for that sometime in the near future. Right, so when we get back to get rows, we're at the bottom. Once we've done our filtering, once we've done our sorting, then we'll go ahead and reset our counter. And then, of course, because we only want tweets, we want the latest to show first, I'll just go ahead and reverse those rows and then yield those back. So that basically makes up the breadth of this archive provider. It's a bare bones archive provider, implements the bare minimum methods, calls using an external interface or external resource for data, and populates our archive control. So that's a very good use of how to do integration with an external application inside 6Web on the archive provider, in the archive control. So I hope that this video was useful and that you're going to be able to leverage it, this information, when you build archive providers and working with archive controls inside the 6Web application. With that, happy programming.